Bore da gyfeillion a chroeso I Pwyllgor Archwilio Iechyd a Gofal Digidol Cymru. Good morning and welcome to the Digital Health and Care Wales Audit and Assurance Committee meeting. You'll be aware that today's meeting is an extraordinary committee meeting to receive the draft accounts for 2021-22. And it's been broken down into three parts. Beginning with item 2.1, presentation of the draft accounts. And this is your opportunity as committee members to consider the draft accounts before the final audited accounts for the last financial year are submitted to be approved by the Audit Committee and subsequently the Board on June the 14th, before submission to the Welsh Government the following day. We'll then turn to item 2.2, Digital Health and Care Wales audit inquiries to those charged with governance and management for the period ending 31st March 2022. This has been included to allow the committee to consider the response to the Audit Wales audit inquiries, which will of course inform Audit Wales's understanding of DHCW, its business processes, and to support their work in providing an audit opinion on the 21-22 financial statements. Should be noted that this item, although not particularly long in terms of the number of audit inquiries, questions and answers, it has come late to committee members, so I'll therefore be asking the Associate Director of Finance, Mark Cox, to talk us through the paper, assuming, of course, that not all committee members will have had the opportunity to read and digest the information in full ahead of today's meeting. And the last substantive agenda item will be the Audit Wales verbal update, and I will, at that point, invite Audit Wales for any comments or observations they may have at this stage of the process that they might want to bring to the committee's attention. I should also mention at the outset, we are recording this meeting, holding it virtually as usual via MS Teams, and the recording will be posted on DHCW's website. And as is usual, today's papers are available for members of the public to access via DHCW's website. But I'm going to start with apologies for absence, and I have a number. Helen Thomas, the Chief Executive, Julie Ash, Head of Corporate Services, Stephen Cheney, Auditor, Gareth Lavington, Head of Counter Fraud, Cardiff and Vale UHB, and Nathan Couch and Darren Griffiths from Audit Wales. And on to declarations of interest. I've not been notified of any conflicts prior to the meeting, but are there any that anyone would wish to declare on any of the agenda items listed before us today? No? In that case, let's move then on to section 2 of the agenda and the presentation of draft accounts for 21-22. I'm going to ask Claire Osmondson-Little, the Executive Director of Finance, to introduce this item and to provide some context, hopefully, before Mark Cox talks us through the detail. And I know Mark is intending to bring in Sian Williams, the Head of Financial Services and Reporting, for comment. Just for context, the draft accounts were submitted to Audit Wales at the end of last month and are here for noting ahead of the audited accounts being submitted to the meeting on June the 14th. But before I hand over to Claire, can I just remind the committee of the board development session held on the draft annual accounts, which all board members received on the 3rd of this month. And these slides are included in Appendix 2 for your information and to ensure openness and transparency. I'm grateful to Claire, Mark and Sian for taking the whole board through the draft accounts in some detail earlier this month. So I'll now hand over to Claire to introduce this item. Diolch, Claire.
Diolch, Marion, and thank you, board. Today is an important milestone in SHA establishment. This is our opportunity to share with you our compliance with the statutory duties set out in our first set of annual accounts, which Mark will take you through. For a bit of context, within our first year, we've established our board and our key members in relation to the operation of a special health authority. That has had a couple of delays in terms of some of the appointment, which has reflected our outturn position in terms of revenue. In addition to that, we've responded and supported the COVID response, enabling the vaccine and the TTP, the track and trace systems, to be fully operational during the period. And in addition to that, we've also been supported with the Digital Priorities Investment funding. But equally, we have undertaken support for the GPs and the GP systems, and equally our health boards and trusts have funded a number of our business line activities in our accounts. So we've had a busy first year in establishing ourselves as a health authority, and in doing that, we've ensured that we've undertaken the correct governance and complied with the statutory duties and requirements. So I'm now going to hand over to Mark Cox to take you through the detail in relation to the content of the statutory accounts. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Claire, and board our pub, and thank you, Marion, for setting the scene in terms of the openness and transparency with which we've tried to conduct the final accounts for this year, and our close liaison. I'd like to set out from the off really with Audit Wales during this process so far. I think it's important to just reflect on the context in which the financial statements have been constructed. As Claire mentioned, this is our first year, and the consequences of that is obviously within the statements. There's no comparators, some prior year comparators, which you would normally see as part of the accounts. So the readers of these set of accounts will need to have that in mind. And also there's a requirement for a 15-month set of accounts. So the usual set of accounts obviously are aligned to financial years, but for this first year we need to do a 15-month set of accounts. What does that mean practically? Effectively means we need to include certain disclosures within the accounts and ensure Audit Wales are cited on any prior year transactions and ensure that they've been recorded correctly within the previous organisation's accounts. So you'll see from the accounts that's on page 1, paragraph 6, it actually sets out the requirements in terms of the treatment of transactions pre-April 1st. So that's one of the key issues in terms of understanding the context in which this set of accounts are set. You'll note also that we've got a balance sheet, and this is as a consequence of the formal transfer of assets and liabilities from Pwyllgor NHS Trust in March, and that's enabled us to formally complete the draft set of accounts, and the set of assets and liabilities transfers were indeed audited via Audit Wales and signed off and approved. In terms of the structure of the accounts, the key financial statements, and there's 5 of them, are within the first 6 pages of the accounts, and they cover the statement of comprehensive net expenditure, and that's on page 2, and that summarises on an accruals basis our net operating costs, and you can see a figure of £87,922, 87 million, apologies, £97,922,000 identified within that particular schedule. In terms of other comprehensive net expenditure, which is on page 3, this purport is a primary statement showing the expenditure impact of changes to fixed asset valuations, but you can also see that it is a nil return in terms of the transactions for the period, but it's required for us to complete as part of the accounts. The third key statement is the statement of financial position at the 31st of March, and that's on page 4. This statement is commonly known as the balance sheet and reflects the organisational assets and liabilities as at the 31st of March. As I mentioned, the formal transfer of assets from Pwyllgor is identified within this particular statement. The following statement on page 5 is the statement in changes in taxpaying secretary, and the statement is now required. It's a new statement required of IS 1, and it's interpreted to include figures for net operating costs for the year and movements in net Welsh Government funding for the year. So you'll identify particular Welsh Government funding in relation to pensions contributions as part of this particular statement. The last statement on page 6 reflects this movement in cash flows for the year. And in effect, there was a notional target of £2 million, a maximum cash balance of £2 million at the end of the financial year, and we hit that notional target at 1.546 million. This was a very interesting task, I think it's safe to say, Claire, at the end of the financial year, given the amount of balances and payments that had to be made up to and including the final week. So the next item I'd like to bring your attention to is not a financial statement, but it's one of the key notes in terms of meeting our statutory financial duties for the organisation. On page 21 and 22, the detailed performance for the organisation is set out within note 2, and it reflects our statutory duties in terms of producing a balanced position in both revenue and capital. We are reporting a small underspend of £366,000 for revenue, and an even smaller underspend in terms of capital of £10,000, which effectively means we've met our obligations, our statutory obligations, in terms of our first financial duty. We've also met our financial targets in terms of PSPP compliance. So that's in terms of paying 95% of all valid invoices within 30 days of receipt, and we are reporting 97% against that target. Shan will highlight some further notes as part of this presentation. It won't be fully exhaustive because fundamentally we've reviewed these accounts, I guess, with the board before, but we do invite questions after these particular notes have been presented.
Thank you, Mark. So there's some 34 notes, and I'm just going to draw attention to 9 of them. So the first one is on page 23, which is the GMS expenditure. There is 17,654,000 relating to GMS expenditure. It's the first time this has been shown in this way, and relates to GMS spend on digital services for primary care, the GMS system, GMS managed print, broadband, and Office 365 and staffing. The next note, which is note 3.2 on page 24, shows the £130 million worth of expenditure, which excludes the GMS expenditure on the previous note. And just to highlight that the category premises contains 38 million. This is where our computer hardware, software licenses, managed services expenditure is categorised, and of which there is the Microsoft deal included within that. So there will be a footnote to this note in the final accounts. The next note I wanted to highlight is note 4, which is on page 25. Miscellaneous, apologies, on page 25. That's 42 million of miscellaneous income, which relates to our SLA contracts with health boards and trusts, which includes the Microsoft recharge and SLAs. Note 9.6 on page 30 is fair pay disclosures. So this note is the first time that this has been presented, showing the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile comparison in pay. So there were no employees that received remuneration in excess of the highest paid director. And I think it's important to note there are no prior year comparators, which makes this note hard to assess or harder to assess. The next note, note 12 on page 37, which highlights our intangible assets. So we have a net book value of £12 million, and intangible assets are those which don't have a physical presence and have a long-term value. So the intangible assets are probably one of the highest in NHS Wales. So it's interesting to draw this to the board's attention. These are split into software purchased and software internally generated. So those we've developed ourselves, which is 2 million software internally generated. The next note is on page 40, which is note 15, trade and other receivables. This note totals £13,707,000. The reason for this value is that prepayments are included within this note, and that's prepayments for services where we pay the invoice within the financial year that relates to future periods. That's called a prepayment. So we have high levels of prepayment due to things like the Microsoft contract running from July to June. So the last quarter would be included within this figure. Note 23. Note 18 on page 43. This is trade and other payables. This is a substantial figure at 15,677,000. And this relates to some of the spend that comes later in the year. So spend on some digital items, some of the digital work is reflected in this higher value. And again, there's no comparator, so it's quite hard to compare to what might be a usual figure for us as an organisation. Note 23, losses and special payment on page 48. This will be reflected of discussions that have taken place in previous audit committees. And the final note to highlight was note 30, related party transactions on page 54. So under IAS 24, we are required to show transactions with related parties to be declared in the accounts. So for DHCW, this would be Welsh Government, NHS organisations and local authorities. So that's in the top section of the note, where we show expenditure, income, amounts due and owed. And then on the bottom section of the note, we're required to show related party transaction with board members. So there's 3 detailed within this note. And that was the end of the notes I wanted to highlight to the audit committee today.
Thank you, Sian. Thank you.
Thank you, Sian. Much appreciated, and I hope that gives the audit committee a sense of some of the material items within the accounts, and I guess some of the quirks in terms of our unique organisation and business activities, particularly around the intangible assets, which I guess we lead the way on in terms of NHS Wales and the values therein. What I would like to touch upon next is the next steps, really, as regards the audit and where we go from here. From a finance perspective, we're due to meet with Audit Wales. We do meet twice a week, but we will be meeting on the 1st of June as part of an accounts closure session, and that will enable us to finalise the accounts and enable the final audit accounts to be submitted to the audit committee and SHE board on June the 14th. The members will also receive an internal paper to accompany accounts, and that internal paper will again go into some detail regarding some of the major elements of the accounts and any observations as part of the auditing process. Audit Wales will issue, and I guess Mike will touch upon this in his section, issue an ISA 260, which is a statement of opinion on the financial statements, and also includes an identification of any findings that have arisen during the audit process. So the audit and the accounts will be approved, and the letter of representation signed on the 14th, and the final accounts will be submitted by 12 o'clock on June the 15th to Welsh Government. Thank you, Chair.
Diolch, Mark. Thank you, and thank you to Claire, Sian and Mark for the clarity of those presentations, highlighting some of those key points for our consideration. I'm going to open the discussion now for any observations, comments or questions, colleagues. You've had a chance to go through the accounts earlier, and of course we had the board development session at the beginning of this month, so you will be fairly familiar with the contents of the accounts by now. Are there any questions or queries? Diolch. I've got our Vice Chair first then, Ruth Glaser.
Diolch Marion, and diolch Claire and Mark. You know, we've had a couple of sessions now on the accounts, and it's always been really clear. And you've presented all the information in a way that's easy for us to get to grips with. So thank you for that. I just wanted to note our forecasting abilities. Lots of our conversations coming up to the end of the year were about how much we still had to pay out. And you know, I will be open about the fact I was dubious as to whether we would meet our forecast, and we did. So I just wanted to say that I'm really pleased with where we've ended up, and that's a testament to the team and the work that they've done. And I know that we've had conversations about how we now start to forecast for the rest of this year. It's never an ideal situation to be waiting for those last few months, biting our nails in the last minute whether it will go through. But I just wanted to say well done to the team on that. It's a good place to come out. I did have a specific question. It was around one of the quirks in our notes that Sian pulled out for us. In other prepayments, everything on that sheet is in other and not broken out, and it's a large amount of money. So I just wanted to understand a bit better that why we've got some items where we've got nothing against it. Is that because of the way the statutory accounts are set out? There's nothing in that other bucket that we can actually pull out and show in there.
Mark, are you going to come in on that?
Yes, can I take that? Yes, Ruth, you're quite right. And I think this is an observation from our first set of accounts as well. The nature of the organisation, the business, and this transactional activity isn't best suited and isn't best fitted to the templates that are issued. Obviously, Welsh governments have to provide consistent templates, and they are weighted obviously towards health boards and trusts, but it doesn't give us any flexibility really, Ruth, to be honest with you, in terms of how we present the accounts. It's very procedural and directional, and obviously we need to comply with that.
And I think that's my question mark, is as we go forwards, we just run the risk of more and more sitting in other buckets, and it doesn't feel very transparent. And I know that for us, we have conversations around what is in there, and we know what's in there, but actually when we present it, it just feels it's going to get worse and worse as we go on, right? Because more and more of what we do will be other.
Thanks for that. Perhaps I'll bring Claire in at this point. Claire.
Thank you. And you're right, Ruth. We want to make sure that the accounts are transparent and that everyone can understand the content. And as a team, we are looking as part of the AGM to complement the set of accounts with a innovative, because we haven't quite got there yet, an innovative presentation. And hopefully we'll bring the accounts to life, and that alongside the statutory, I hope, will enable anyone in Wales to look at that and understand what that means in terms of the Welsh pound. So I think there is almost two sides to it. There's a statutory requirement that enables us, which doesn't enable us to be innovative in terms of the way it's being presented, and it's a matter of fact. And I think that's something, together with my audit colleagues, maybe we need to look at in terms of their interpretation and being able to really understand the contents of the accounts, and particularly in a digital era, to really bring that formality in line with the modern day spend types, for want of a better word. But so hopefully in time of the AGM, we will complement the set of accounts and bring them to life in a way that will really demonstrate to anyone what does this mean in terms of what we spent and what value we created from a digital perspective for the NHS.
Thank you, Claire. There's a thumbs up there, and I think that's a great idea to enhance the accounts and, as you say, bring it to life. And there's a great opportunity at that public annual general meeting to do so. So we shall look forward to that in due course. I've got a couple more questions or comments from David Selway and then Grace Quantock. David.
Thanks, Marion. Firstly, I'd just like to echo my thanks as well to those Ruth's already tabled around the clarity of the presentations, the papers, and the briefing session that we had at the board development session. That's been really helpful in getting a good feel for what's being presented today. I just have one point of clarification. It relates to the intangible assets and the value we've assigned to internally developed software. Can I just clarify, is that a total value for the software that we've produced to date, or is it an in-year value of what we've added to our asset base? Could somebody just clarify that for me, please?
Who's going to respond there? Is that Mark or Claire?
Yeah, happy to pick up, David. So it is the total value, and the total value is predicated upon total costs. So fundamentally, it'll be capitalizable staff based on their salaries and the direct costs associated with the construction of each individual asset or software developed.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Mark. That's helpful. And just for clarity, are we depreciating that as the software ages?
We are amortizing, because it's an intangible asset, it will be amortized, and obviously depreciation is on the tangible fixed assets.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Diolch David, diolch Mark, and finally Grace Quantock.
Thank you for this, and I firstly want to echo my colleagues to say, you know, it was great.
We're struggling a bit to hear you, Grace. Can you just go a bit closer to the mic, or just speak slightly more strongly? Oh, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I will do my best. Thank you very much. Yes, just to echo my colleagues, thank you for all the detail we got from you in the development day on this. Questions I had were covered in that detail that you gave. So I do have one small, which I'm bringing now, but I did also want to just really commend what you're saying, Claire, in terms of the breaking down the accounts in a way that's really communicatable and understandable, because part of our responsibility to be transparent as a board, I think, is to be transparent in a way that people can actually pick up and use. And so there is that responsibility not only to do this standard which we have to do in a governance form, but actually because we know that healthcare matters so much to people in Wales and how their money is spent, we actually do then, I think, as a board, need to go that step further and make sure we're meeting people where they are, and we're breaking it down in a way that really fits, particularly because as a digital board, we're not fitting in those standard boxes. And I imagine, you know, over time, the level and the way that is done will start to shift as more and more health boards start to incorporate digital into their day-to-day applications, just as we do when we raise the profile of digital across Wales. My question was, in terms of the prompt payment code, you know, it's fantastic that we're doing 97%, in the NHS 82%, and I am aware that obviously the cost of living and the difficulties that many companies and people are facing are very, very high. Is there, although we're within the target, do we have any sense of how we can actually address that and go further within that target?
Claire.
Thank you, Grace. So the answer is yes. I'd like to see 97% for both, whether it's a ex-NHS or non-NHS, and they are, relatively speaking, a smaller number of transactions in relation to that. So it's something that we will certainly target. But equally, I would say that as part of the procurement exercises that Michelle and the team are working on, is that we are proactively trying to promote and exploit Welsh-sourced transactions and parties to really try and ensure that wherever possible and wherever relevant, we spend that money within Wales and exploit the Welsh economy and support them in this very difficult time. So there is that, and yeah, and I think the other thing is that through our monthly board meetings, we are trying to present the financial accounts in a meaningful and engaging way. So hopefully that will complement as we go, as we mature as an organisation in really bringing greater transparency around the digital spend and the value that would create. Yeah, I think, like you said, there is no prior year comparator. So this is our first year, and it would have been good to see both above 90%. They're not. And that's certainly in an area over the forthcoming year we will focus on together with shared services to enable that improvement.
Diolch Claire, and thank you Grace for raising that issue. I can't see any other hands up, so I'm going to draw this discussion to a close then. As you've heard, it is the first year of business for DHCW, and I think subject to audit, of course, it's very pleasing to note that we appear to have met our first financial duty, which is to remain within our revenue funding envelope and to remain within our capital funding envelope also. So just to echo the comments you've heard around the virtual table this morning, I think congratulations and our thanks to Claire, Mark, Sian and the team behind who've worked so hard to deliver the accounts and to present them in such a clear and meaningful way. It is very much appreciated. So we are being asked to note then the draft annual accounts for 21-22, which we do so. Let's turn now then to the next agenda item, which is 2.2. And I'm going to invite Mark Hawkes now to talk us through this item, which, as mentioned earlier, the audit inquiries have been included in the papers for this committee for noting. So can I ask Mark to come in then to take us through this paper? As it's a fairly late paper, we would appreciate you highlighting any key issues for those who've not had the opportunity to absorb its contents fully yet. Diolch.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for accepting these papers for consideration at this meeting. I think it's important that these particular responses are noted at this session, fundamentally because they're linked to the letter of representation, which will be signed on June the 14th, and is currently being drafted by Audit Wales. I guess Mike can touch upon this during his session. In terms of the response, the response to the queries raised by Audit Wales are fundamentally to give them reasonable assurance that the financial statements, when taken as a whole, are free from fraud and are free from misstatement due to error as well. There are a number of declarations and identification of processes which are undertaken by the organisation in order to support that. And I'd like to just touch upon some of the responses in probably more detail than normal as a consequence of the papers being delayed. The appendices which are attached cover 3 areas. The first is identification of queries relating to fraud. The second is in relation to laws and regulations, and the third are matters in relation to third parties. So what kind of processes we've currently got in place that ensure that third party linkages are monitored and reported. So I'd like to identify specifically page 2 and question 1, and this surrounds the management assessment of risk that the financial statements will be materially misstated due to fraud. We have responded that there is a low risk of the financial statements being misstated due to fraud, and that's consequently as a result of the recent audits that have taken place, which has placed substantial assurance regarding our financial control procedures and the procedures that are in place surrounding reporting. So from my perspective and from the perspective of the group, then we're happy that that's a low risk in terms of the risk to fraud and misstatement for this set of accounts. Page 3, question 2, identifies what processes are employed to identify and respond to risks of fraud. We've identified that we have a service being provided by Carvin Vale the local counter fraud service, and that's reviewed in terms of the annual plan, which is set out at the start of the financial year, and reports are submitted to the audit committee, and any instances of fraud are flagged up as part of the committee. We have also responded that at the present time there are no instances of fraud that have been recorded for the term. Page 4, question 3, identifies again what arrangements are in place to report fraud issues and risks to the Audit and Assurance Committee. And again, it identifies the fact that the fraud is a standing item on the agenda, and we have an attendee from Cardiff Vale who leads that particular item. Page 4, question 4, requires queries the assurance around how management has communicated expectations of ethical governance and standards in terms of conduct and behaviour to all relevant parties, and the process is identified within the standards of behaviour policy, which was approved and adopted by the SHA board on the 1st of April 2021. The content of the policy is included as part of the DHEW corporate induction for all new staff starting within DHEW, so there's complete coverage there. Page 4, question 5, queries if we're aware of any instances of actual or suspected or alleged fraud. So it goes a little step further in terms of alleged fraud rather than actual instances. And we have responded that there are no actual, suspected or alleged instances of fraud during the reporting period. Page 6, question 1, queries, are we aware of any instances of fraud? And again, we have responded that there are no instances since the 1st of January 2021. Page 8, question 2, identifies queries, have there been any instances of non-compliance or suspected non-compliance to relevant laws and regulations since the 1st of January 2021, which may have an ongoing impact to the 21-22 financial statements, and we have declared that there have been no instances of non-compliance or suspected non-compliance within that period. Page 8, question 3, queries if there are any potential litigations or claims that will affect the financial statements. And again, we have responded that there are no potential litigations or claims that will affect the financial statements. Page 8, question 4, queries if there have been any reports from other regulatory bodies, such as HM Revenues and Customs, which indicate non-compliance. And we have declared that there are no reports from HMRC or other regulatory bodies indicating non-compliance. Page 10, question 2, queries if we are aware of any instances of non-compliance to relevant laws and regulations, and we have declared that there have been no reports of instances of non-compliance and with relevant laws and regulations. Page 13, question 1, confirms that we've disclosed to the auditor the identity of any related parties and the nature of relationships within these related parties. And we can confirm that DHEW has disclosed the necessary details and disclosures relevant to related parties in terms of identity, relationships and transactions. So, Chair, I just thought I'd like to go into detail in terms of some of the key disclosures and declarations as part of this return, given the quick turnaround in terms of submission and this meeting. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mark. I can't see any hands up at the moment. I think it's really helpful you to have taken us through that paper, and it does make reference, of course, to some of the reports that have been coming to audit on a routine basis during the course of the last financial year. But I think it's very helpful for this extraordinary meeting to hear DHEW's response to those audit inquiries, so thank you for that. I'll take the first question then from Ruth Glazer, please.
Thanks, Marion, and thanks, Mark, for that really helpful summary. I think the only thing that I would note at this point, and it doesn't relate, this is obviously a backward-looking report to last year's accounts, but it's probably worth noting at this point that we have discussed as a committee what the cost of living crisis might do to our risk profile when it comes to fraud. So in terms of that question on page 5 around oversight for identifying and responding to risks, I think we've got positive action there in terms of our forward-looking approach. So I thought that was just worth noting at this point in time. So thank you.
Diolch, Ruth. Thank you for highlighting that. It's a key point. I can't see any other hands up, so therefore I intend to bring this discussion to a close. And we note as a committee then the response to audit inquiries to those charged, and I quote, with governance and management for the period ending 31st of March 2022, i.e. this particular committee. So let's move on then to the Audit Wales update, and I'll now ask Mike Quickly from Audit Wales for any comments or observations, any updates for this committee that we should be taking into account at this stage of the process. We've heard that the audit accounts will be submitted to the committee, to this committee, on the 14th of June for approval. So, Mike, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I've got to say that kind of between yourself, Claire, and Mark, you've probably covered most of what I got written down that I was gonna set out. So thank you for picking those up on my behalf. I guess in terms of a general overview, the audit's kind of progressing as we'd expect. As we reflected at the last committee, the engagement from Mark, Sian, and the team is really positive and continues to be really positive. The bi-weekly meetings we're having are really helpful in terms of us managing the audit queries and ensuring we're getting timely responses. So we've had no concerns over the timeliness or the quality of the responses. I had a catch up with the audit team this morning just to kind of get their views and if there was anything they wanted me to feed back, and they asked me to feedback that from their perspective they feel the relationships on a kind of on their level are really good and really positive, and officers have been really kind of receptive to our thoughts and findings, and clearly it's a learning experience on both sides given it's kind of year one of audit and year one of accounts. I'd observed the draft accounts as presented, are a good set of accounts, which is really pleasing to see, not unexpected, but still really, really pleasing to see that, there was always a risk that there could be kind of, obvious errors in there, given the timescales and given, first year set of accounts, but happy to report nothing of that nature. The working papers are strong. We've worked with Sian and Mark to set out our expectations of the kind of areas we'd expect to be covered. But it's really pleasing to see again that those working papers are really good. Explanations are kind of included and setting out the key judgments that Mark and the team have made when pulling stuff together. That's not something that we generally experience at all client sites that we audit. So, given it's year one, I think that's really positive. So that's kind of just a general update on where we're up to with the audit, all going to plan as it stands. So clearly, we're still 24th of May, but, don't want to kind of jinx anything, but it's all going well from my perspective. I thought it might be helpful if members could just, I suppose I was thinking of just giving an oversight of what the ICE 260 will contain, so you know what to expect when it comes. If you've not seen one before, if you've seen one before, then please kind of disregard all of these. But I think it must be helpful to set out those kind of areas that it will cover. As Mark indicated, that will include our proposed audit opinion on the accounts. So those, as that is going to the committee in the morning and board in the afternoon, though that will just set out our proposed opinion, what we think the Auditor General will sign off when he signs off his accounts, and those will lay at the Senate later. Mark also covered off the letter of representation. So this is just a standard requirement on us under auditing standards to get representations from the wording, as you quoted earlier, Chair, those charged with governance and management, just around completeness of disclosures, not withholding information that might be pertinent to our audit, and so on and so forth. So there's a standard set of kind of disclosures that we will share with you, that we'd expect to receive back, duly signed to confirm that those things have been met. There is a section in the letter of rep which will include any unadjusted misstatements arising from the audit. At this stage, until we have the closure meeting, as Mark alluded to, I'm not aware that there will be any unadjusted misstatements, but if there were any, what we would then do is include them in the letter of representation, so members can see those, and will then expect an explanation to be included as to why any amendments want to be made. So it could well be, if let's make an example of, if we saw something that's clearly trivial, very, very small, the response could be, we're not making this amendment because it's of such a small nature and the value of it, we might not want to do that, and that's fine. It's just that to make members aware that if there are any, they'll be in the letter, and we'll be expecting an explanation as to why those things haven't been amended. No indications from Mark and the team of any findings so far that won't be amended. I think we've had some issues going back with Welsh Government around the template accounts, which I think was the point Ruth was making. They are quite rigid, and where we might want to make changes, effectively that template then has to be unlocked by Welsh Government for Mark and Sian to make any kind of changes, and then it gets relocked again. So it is quite a tightly controlled process. But we've got a couple of areas where we've kind of sought to get those unlocked, and Welsh Government have been really receptive to that, and Mark and the team are kind of going through that. There is also potential in the letter of representation to include any specific representations on any areas which we may feel particularly contentious. Not expecting there to be any. There's certainly nothing coming out of the audit work, but if there were areas where we might seek specific representations on specific issues, those would also be in there. So that's kind of broadly what the auditing standards need us to do. In terms of the ISO 260 itself, that will contain a summary and an appendix at the back of the adjustments made to the draft accounts. So generally speaking, those would normally be covered off in, say, like Mark's covering report that goes along with the audited accounts, but we need to record those and communicate those to yourselves as the committee who considers the accounts, to make sure you're aware of kind of what the nature of the errors were that gave rise to those amendments, and for you to be satisfied that those have been appropriately dealt with. And then lastly, in the ISO 260, just any recommendations on the back of any of our findings. So sounds like a lot, and it's a fairly meaty report, but it is really important in terms of communicating the findings of our audit. So that's what will be coming in the next meeting in June. Afterwards, once the dust has settled on the audit, probably just worth pointing out that we have an internal kind of post-project learning where we sit down as a team and look at what went well from our perspective, what didn't go so well from our perspective, and then we'll have a similar meeting with Mark and Sian and the team to understand, from their perspective, what worked, what didn't work, on both sides, and how can we seek to improve the process going forward. So, those are very open kind of discussions, where hopefully we can look to streamline the process next year, but I'm not flagging any particular concerns at this stage. I think lastly, just one thing to mention on the previous agenda item. Fraud from our perspective also includes deliberate financial misreporting, so not necessarily kind of theft or anything like that. It could be that you will see in our audit plan we had a risk around management override of controls. So that's a default significant risk for us to look at, and it links in with the fact that mainly more in the commercial world, but clearly we've got statutory financial targets in the accounts. If management were minded to deliberately move that to make sure they met that target, That consists fraud under the ISA as well, so it was just to bring that to members' attention. Happy to take any questions or observations.
Thank you, Mike. That's really helpful in terms of flagging out what we can expect at our next meeting in well, 3 weeks' time, essentially, isn't it? So very, very helpful indeed. I can't see any questions or comments. I think you've provided a very clear update, which has answered any queries or points of clarification that we might have had. So that's been really helpful. Can I just ask a final question, although you've indicated that all is well and that we appear to be on course, notwithstanding you've got a fair bit of work to complete between now and the 14th. But are you confident, therefore, that we are on course to present the final audited accounts to Welsh Government on June the 15th?
Yes, Chair, happy to confirm that. As part of the audit planning process and discussing the approach with Mark and the team, we kind of try and target the big areas of the audit up front. So we try and get those out of the way as soon as we can, so that should anything significant come out of the woodwork or the testing, or then we've got sufficient time to deal with that and deal with any potential additional testing. So we've targeted the tangible and intangible assets as an example, big area. Lots of spend, as Shan pointed out, lots of intangible assets there that's not normally our experience of kind of auditing in the NHS in Wales. So, we need to make sure that we've given ourselves sufficient time to fully understand the nature of those assets, how they're being treated, and so on. So all that work is well progressed. But overall, yeah, we're in line with plan. And I just need to confirm with Chris when papers are expected for that audit committee on 14th of June. I probably have got that information, but it's completely gone out of my head, so apologies. So yeah, happy to confirm that, Chair.
Thank you, Mike. That's pleasing to hear. So to sum up then, I think it's been very pleasing to hear about the positive and constructive relationship that's developed between our colleagues at the HCW and yourselves in Audit Wales. It echoes what we've heard before, and I think it's a tribute to the values and the behaviours of our staff here, Claire and the finance team. And I think on behalf of colleagues on this committee, I'd like to extend my appreciation to the team for the way they've conducted themselves and delivered the draft accounts to this point. I think there's a lot to be proud of at the end of our first year of business. So thank you for that, and thank you all to those of you who've presented at today's meeting, and to colleagues for your engagement as well in the discussions. I've not been advised of any other urgent business in advance of today's meeting, so unless there aren't any other comments or observations, I intend to draw this meeting to a close. As you've heard, the next meeting specifically scheduled to consider the audited accounts will be on June the 14th, followed by our next scheduled meeting of Audit and Assurance Committee that will take place on July the 4th. So I'm sure we'll be seeing some of you before then at Ward on Thursday, but for today's meeting, thank you for your engagement and your attendance. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd. Goodbye for now.